Hello, welcome to this seminar on motivation. Motivation is one of the most significant topics in management. We humans are very complex creatures, and our behaviour at any given time is influenced by a range of factors, such as our personality, our moods, our needs, etc., as well as the circumstances of the situation in which we find ourselves. This makes it very difficult to explain or predict human behaviour with any degree of certainty. Nevertheless, because managing people is about influencing behaviour, it is not surprising that so much research has been carried out into what motivates us to choose to behave one way rather than another. There are many ways of looking at motivation. It is something we sense in ourselves. That is, like we choose to behave in a way rather than another. Sometimes we try to generate it in others. We cheer our team, we praise a job well done, or we dare people to do something. All this in the belief that it will encourage them to do so. Organisations are constantly trying to improve it by introducing bonus schemes or nominating an employer of the month. And finally, it can be difficult to sustain. The motivation to do things well and to behave in a certain way can fade over time. Let's look at some definitions. A motive is an individual's reason for choosing one certain behaviour from among several choices. Motivation has a number of definitions. These two are useful. A set of forces that lead people to behave in particular ways. This implies, of course, a combination of forces. Or the process by which a person's efforts are energized, directed, and sustained towards attaining a goal. Probably this definition relates more to organizations, and you'll see that it highlights the importance of putting energy into the effort, directing it in a particular direction, and also keeping it up over a period of time, sustaining the effort. A drive is somewhat different. Drives are innate biological determinants of behaviour activated by deprivation. That means that there's something within us that we need, and in order to satisfy this need, we behave in certain ways. Examples of this would be curiosity, sense-making, order and meaning, effectiveness or competency, self-understanding. Now, this is a brief list, but it gives you an example of this desire that's in all of us. If we look at curiosity, the desire that's in us from childhood to figure things out, to put meaning on things. And if we look at order and meaning, the desire that's in all of us to bring order to our lives in some way and to understand the things that are happening to us. So they're drives, and we're born with them. People's behaviour is therefore influenced by a combination of innate drives and acquired motives. This really means it's a combination of our own desires from within and wants or needs that we acquire as we go through life. Drives then are innate. they have a physiological bias. They're activated by deprivation. In other words, if we're hungry and we want to satisfy that hunger, then we're motivated to eat something. They're aimed at satisfaction, and this is an important point, they can be overridden. So in other words, we can refrain from satisfying that particular need. So perhaps if we are hungry, we can hold off eating something until the time is more convenient. On the other hand, motives are learned. They have a social bias. In other words, they're influenced by the people and the environment in which we operate. They're activated by the environment itself, and they're aimed at stimulation. The importance of motivation in organizations today. Early ideas believed that selecting suitable people, telling them what to do, training them, paying them, and monitoring their performance was sufficient to keep them motivated. This was valid when most work was manual, jobs were difficult to get, and worker expectations were low. But the scene is quite different today. A number of things have happened. Technology has changed the work practices radically. The balance of work has shifted from making things, or manufacturing, to providing services, and to what's known as knowledge working. Knowledge working really implies working with ideas, creativity, innovation, etc. Organizations have got flatter, giving more authority down the line. This really means that organizations have taken out layers of management in their structure and, partly assisted by technology, have been able to pass authority and responsibility further down the line, so that people further down the line can take decisions that would formerly have been passed up to higher levels of management. The workforce has become much more diverse. We have different cultures in the workplace. We have different educational levels working together. We have specialists working with generalists, and we have people of varying ages. So the whole diversity within an organisation makes it more difficult to identify what will motivate one person and perhaps not motivate another. Expectations of workers have raised. What has happened here really is that over the passage of time, people have begun to expect more in return for the effort that they put into the organisation. They feel they have the option to move or to demand more through their representatives and so forth. Finally, it's worth remembering that competitive advantage now comes from creating a work environment which encourages employees to give of their best willingly and to keep doing so. Hence the focus on motivation. In many ways, the challenge for management then is to get the balance right among a number of things. The first of these is within the workplace, providing economic rewards. Things like pay, fringe benefits, pension, security, etc. They have an instrumental orientation. In other words, they provide the people who receive them with the means to acquire whatever they want in life. On the other hand, there's the question of intrinsic satisfaction. And really this is the satisfaction that people derive from their interest in the work they're doing, from the opportunities that work perhaps gives them to grow and develop themselves. That's known as a personal orientation. And then finally, the whole area of social relationships. This is about friendships and group working affiliation and status within the organisation, etc. This area is known as relational orientation. So what's really required for managers then is to get the balance right between these three different areas, and to remember that the comparative strength of a person's needs and expectations in each of these areas will influence their motivation to behave in a certain way. Research has therefore focused on two aspects of motivation. What motivates people, and how does it do so? Theories exploring the what aspect are called content or needs theories. They identify a range of needs or desires that shape our behaviour. And theories exploring the how are called process theories, and they explain how these needs actually influence our behaviour. Remember that theories in social science are just propositions. They are constantly being expanded, contested, modified, or disproved. Also, some theories contain models depicting cause and effect connections. The main theories we'll be looking at in this seminar are, under the content theories, the hierarchy of needs, the manifest needs theory, the ERG theory, the dual structure theory, and the acquired needs theory. Within the process theories, we'll be looking at the expectancy model, we'll be looking at the equity theory, the goal setting theory, and finally theory X and theory Y. The content theories suggest a range of needs that drive our behaviour, some placing them in a hierarchy, other theories claiming that we learn them throughout our life, and another linking them perhaps with job satisfaction. The process theories illustrate how these needs actually shape our behaviour, some focusing on our expectations, some theories on the sense of justice we have, and others on how we respond to clear goals. How does motivation actually work? Let's look at a very simple model. We experience a need deficiency. In other words, we feel that we need something. We search for ways to satisfy this need. We select behaviour likely to succeed from a range of choices. We enact that behaviour. In other words, that's performance. We experience rewards or punishment as a result of that behaviour. And then we reassess the need deficiency to see whether it has been satisfied or not. That's a very simple model of how motivation actually works. Let's look at the first of these theories, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's basic idea, which dates from 1943, is that people are wanting beings, always wanting something more, and what they want at any given time depends on what they already have. He suggested that our needs can be divided into 5 categories, and that they have a hierarchical order. The first of these is physiological. The next is security. The next level is belongingness. The next level is esteem. And the highest level is self-actualization. Once a lower need has been satisfied, it no longer acts as a motivator. Only the unsatisfied needs provide motivation. This really means that we start at the lowest level, which is physiological, and that once the needs at that level have been satisfied, we are then motivated to try and satisfy the needs at the next level, which is security. And then once they've been sufficiently satisfied, we are motivated by trying to achieve our needs at the next level. So this is how the hierarchy actually works. Examples in a general sense would be, if you look at the physiological level, the whole idea of sustenance, food, shelter, etc., they fall within that category. Within the security level, the stability in our lives, within the belongingness level, friendship of others, contact with other people, being a part of a group, etc. Esteem has very much to do with respect that other people show to us, the kind of status we might have in life. And finally, the self-actualization, which is believed to be when all the other needs have been satisfied, this idea of fulfilling our own full potential. That's regarded as achievement. If we look at organizational examples, just put this in an organizational setting, we'll see that the physiological examples would be pay, access to a cafe or food within the organization, etc. Security examples might be a pension plan or job security. Belongingness, being part of a work group, having our own friends at work, being part of professional groups perhaps. Esteem, areas that represent that in an organization might be a job title, social recognition, feedback from people within the organization. And finally, the self-actualization. An organizational example might be having a challenging, demanding job, scope for creativity, promotion, etc. Maslow stressed that although needs may in general be ranked in a hierarchical order, as we've seen here, this order is not necessarily fixed for everybody. Individuals may differ in the importance they place on each one, and this may vary over time. So this means that as people move through life or through various life stages, the preferences they have will change, and they may not adhere strictly to this hierarchy. There have been some criticisms of Maslow's theory, although it's still in good standing and it's been found to be quite useful. Some criticisms include it makes intuitive sense and it's probably the best known to managers, and that's true. Most people can understand it and they can relate to it. It provides a useful framework, a starting point, if you like, for looking at motivation. The 5 levels are not always present. The hierarchy does not always apply, as Maslow himself pointed out. Individual needs can be satisfied outside the work situation. And that's important from an organizational perspective, because these needs may exist for individual people, but they live a life outside the organization, and they may well find ways of satisfying these needs outside the organization and unknown to the organization. And also it's been said that it's probably more of a social philosophy reflecting white American middle class values rather than a concrete theory. A development, I suppose, on Maslow's theory is the manifest needs theory proposed by Murray in 1938. And he again listed a number of different needs that people have in their lives. If we just look through these here: achievement, the need for affiliation, the need for aggression to assert ourselves, the need for autonomy, for exhibition, for impulsivity, for nurturance, for order, the need for power, and the need for understanding. This is a range of needs. Some of them agree or coincide with Maslow's needs, but Murray's point was that many of these may operate to varying degrees at the same time, that they're not necessarily in any hierarchical order. Appropriate environmental conditions are necessary before these needs manifest themselves. So in other words, depending on the situation in which people find themselves, these needs will either become more pressing or diminish. He also made the point that they each have two components: the direction, that is the person or the object that will satisfy the need, and then the intensity, and that is the importance of the need. The next content theory is known as the ERG theory, and it identifies three needs: growth needs, relatedness needs, and existence needs. Now, Alderfer's contention was that, again, he identified these three needs that are present, and they coincide largely with Maslow's identification also. But his progression is that we move from one to the other. So once the existence needs have been satisfied, or largely satisfied, we progress up to the relatedness needs. That's the satisfaction progression arrow there. And then once the relatedness needs have been satisfied, we progress up to the growth needs. His point also was, of course, that we can regress. So in other words, if it turns out that the growth needs are not being satisfied sufficiently for us, we are capable of settling for the relatedness needs. In other words, our needs level goes back down to the relatedness needs. And similarly, if it turns out that the relatedness needs are not being sufficiently met, we are capable of settling for and being motivated by the existence needs. His point was then that they may operate to varying degrees at the same time. There is a hierarchical order. He does not assume that people always behave logically or rationally. And that's an important point. We should never presume that because there are theories about motivation, that humans are always rational beings and that they behave in a predictable or even logical way. And finally, the frustration, regression and satisfaction progression component suggests that we can move up and down in these needs. Next we move to Herzberg's dual structure theory. Herzberg's theory suggests that the opposite of satisfaction is not necessarily dissatisfaction, but rather that it is no satisfaction. And that the opposite of dissatisfaction is no dissatisfaction. Basically, his research indicated that a certain number of factors, let's say in our working life, contribute to levels of dissatisfaction. For example, the level of supervision that goes on in the workplace or the way in which it's exercised, the actual working conditions under which people need to work, interpersonal relationships in the workplace, our pay and job security, and overall company policies. In his research, they were identified as factors that caused people to be dissatisfied in their workplace. He called these hygiene factors. On the other hand, he identified a different range of factors that actually cause people to be satisfied with their work situation. Under this heading, we have a sense of achievement, the recognition that people receive for the work they've done, the work itself, the nature of the work and the satisfaction that comes from it, responsibility that we exercise in work and that we are given, and then the scope for advancement and growth through our work. The main point of the dual structure theory is that addressing the dissatisfiers, in other words the hygiene factors, is important in organizations before we attempt to motivate people by improving the motivational factors. Put simply, this means that if people are preoccupied with being unhappy in their job because of any of these hygiene factors, they're unlikely to focus on or notice the motivational factors until the needs they have in this category, in the hygiene factors, have been met. Some comments about Herzberg's theory. Results of subsequent research have been contradictory, suggesting that the theory may be method-bound. Now, Herzberg's research method consisted of actually asking people to remember instances in their job when they felt very unhappy and dissatisfied, and also to remember instances when they felt really happy and really satisfied. And then, through that research, he was able to identify the factors that caused both of these different feelings in the workplace. And the critics then would suggest that this methodology was not particularly reliable. Also, the original population sampled were engineers and accountants, and the suggestion was that they are not typical of the general working population, and therefore the theory may not have broad application across a range of different workers. The impact of any given factor may depend on the individual's age and status, and it does not define the relationship between satisfaction and motivation. Nevertheless, the theory is popular with managers because Herzberg suggested how it could be applied in practice. In other words, focusing on the motivating factors, it was possible to enrich jobs or change the way work is actually done in order to make them more satisfying for people, and that was a practical tool that was very useful for practicing managers. McClelland's acquired needs theory talked about three basic needs that people have in life: the need for achievement, the need for affiliation, and the need for power. In the work situation, achievement meaning having the opportunity to do more challenging work, affiliation, having good social relations with others in the workplace, and power really meaning control over one's own environment, referred to as socialized power, or the power to influence how things are done in an organization. McClelland claimed that needs are acquired or developed through life experience, so they'd be very different from the innate drives we talked about at the beginning of this seminar. The impact on performance will depend on which need is dominant at any particular time. So this subscribes to the view that our needs vary from time to time, and therefore the extent to which satisfying these needs will influence our behaviour also varies. McClelland used what was known as projective tests to measure these needs. In other words, he showed ambiguous pictures, if you like, and asked people to interpret what was happening in these various pictures. And as a result of this, then, these main themes emerged as the themes that seem to be in people's minds most of the time. A point about people with a high need for achievement that's perhaps significant in an organizational context. One might expect that people very high on this achievement need would be very high performers, and that would they would frequently end up as chief executives of organizations. But this, it appears, is not always the case, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they prefer moderate task difficulty rather than unchallenging or highly challenging tasks. So if they have this deep need to achieve, they're not attracted by tasks that don't challenge them, but similarly, they are not attracted to tasks that are so difficult they feel they can never achieve them. They prefer to take personal responsibility for performance rather than shared responsibility. This means that they are reluctant to delegate. Again, this comes from their need for achievement. They're unlikely to pass on the credit or the authority to somebody else to achieve in their place. They need clear and prompt feedback on performance for the purpose of self-evaluation. So in other words, they don't function particularly well in an environment where they don't get pretty immediate or clear feedback on how well they are achieving. This is significant for top personnel in an organization because frequently they're engaged in strategic work, and by its nature it's not possible to get feedback on strategic decisions until a number of years have passed. And also they tend to be more innovative, seeking new ways or shortcuts, and they avoid routine. Let's just look briefly at the similarities then between the theories we've looked at under the needs category: Herzberg's theory, Maslow's theory, Alderfer's theory, and McClelland's acquired needs theory. We can see here that quite a number of them actually overlap. The motivational factors talked about by Herzberg, they pretty well equate to the self-actualization factors identified by Maslow, the growth needs identified by Alderfer, and the achievement needs referred to by McClelland. Similarly, many of the hygiene factors and recognition from the motivation factors under Herzberg's theory equate to esteem for Maslow, relatedness for Alderfer, and power and affiliation under McClelland's acquired needs. Job security and company policies link pretty well with security under Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the existence needs referred to by Alderfer. We can see from this then that there is a degree of overlap between the various needs identified by the different researchers in dealing with these theories. Let's move to the process theories. The process theories are the theories that focus on how these needs actually motivate us and cause us to behave in certain ways. The first of these is Vroom's expectancy theory. Vroom's model suggests that we put effort into doing something. We do this in the belief or the expectancy that the effort will result in a level of performance, and that level of performance will be instrumental in getting us something which we want or satisfying some of our needs. He identified two levels of outcomes within this model. The performance-related outcomes, they're the first level outcomes, and they would come probably from doing the job itself. So if we expend the effort, achieve a performance, we get our first payback, as it were, in terms of satisfaction from the job itself. But then it moves on to providing a second level of outcomes for us, in terms, examples given here, in terms of praise or perhaps higher wages or esteem or friendship from our colleagues as a result of our performance. The first expectancy then that Vroom talks about is the expectancy at the beginning after the effort on our diagram here, and that's the perceived probability that the effort will lead to the first level outcomes. In other words, we'll put the effort in the belief that we'll actually succeed in achieving a level of performance. The second expectancy arises from the instrumentality, and that's the perceived probability that the first level outcomes will lead to the second level outcomes. In other words, if we achieve a high level of performance in the organization, that will actually succeed in satisfying the needs that we set out to satisfy in the first instance. Vroom recognized that this wasn't an automatic process, and that the performance, despite the effort that we put into it, depends on two other factors if it's to achieve satisfactory outcomes. One is the environment in which we actually operate. That would be the support from the organization. And secondly, our own ability to actually do the job or to perform. So they impact on the level of performance in addition to the effort we put in. Similarly, when we talk about the needs that are motivating us, and we talked about praise, high wages, or friendship here as an example, the anticipated satisfaction from these outcomes is referred to by Vroom as the valence. In other words, really how much value we place on receiving or satisfying these needs. And they will influence the level of effort and the motivation that we'll have in approaching our job. Somewhat later, Porter and Lawler modified and added to this model, and they talk again about effort leading to performance, leading to outcome, and then leading to satisfaction. The level of effort will be influenced by the value of the reward anticipated and the perceived effort reward probability. In other words, the belief that the effort put in will actually result in our getting the reward that we seek. The expectation that the effort expended will lead to the required level of performance influences the degree of effort we put in. And similarly, the expectation that the level of performance achieved will be instrumental in obtaining the desired outcomes. You can see this is very similar to Vroom's model. Again, the effort on its own won't necessarily achieve what we want. It will depend on our own abilities and our personal characteristics or traits, and also, of course, on our perception of the role that we're fulfilling, the clarity in our own minds of what we actually have to do. Porter and Lawler refer specifically to intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. Intrinsic rewards are the rewards that we get from actually doing the job itself, the satisfaction that the job itself yields to us. And extrinsic rewards are the rewards we get, usually by the organization, for actually doing the job. Things like pay and bonuses and praise and acclaim, etc. Porter and Lawler also raised the issue of the perceived equity of the rewards. And their point here really is that once we expend the effort, achieve the performance we wanted, and receive whatever satisfaction we expected as a result of that performance, there's also the issue then of our perception as to whether that's fair relative perhaps to other people in the organization who might have received more reward for putting in the same effort. And that whole equity area then feeds right back, as the arrow suggests here, into the extent to which we're prepared to put effort in future to do the same kind of work if we feel that the reward has been somewhat unfair. And overall then, this is a continuous loop, and therefore the degree of satisfaction we receive from actually doing the work will influence us the next time we're expected to perform in that particular situation. Our level of effort will be governed by our recollection of how well we were rewarded for performing in the last time around. There are some criticisms of expectancy theory. One is that it's difficult to apply directly to the workplace because it is rather complex. Nevertheless, it has given useful guidelines to management, and it seems to apply more to an attitude than to actual performance. This is probably inescapable if we are trying to explore why various needs influence people to work in a certain way. We talked about equity earlier. Adams produced an equity theory to explain how this process operates, and basically he's saying that we have a tendency to compare ourselves with others. And if we're satisfied with what we're getting relative to what other people are receiving, then we're motivated to maintain our current situation. In other words, we continue to operate and put the effort in. On the other hand, if we perceive inequity, in other words, if we believe we're being unfairly treated, or indeed, perhaps if we feel that other people are being unfairly treated relative to ourselves, then we are motivated to try and even out or reduce this inequity. There are a couple of options that are open to us in doing this. We can try to change the outcomes. In other words, we can perhaps negotiate with the organisation we work for to try and get more for the effort, or more reward for the effort that we're putting in. We might change the inputs. And this means that if we can change the reward we get, we maybe try to put less effort in, and that makes restores the inequity somewhat for us. We may alter the comparison person's outcomes. In other words, this wouldn't be a very popular move, but people may feel inclined to go to their manager and complain about the fact that other people are getting a better deal than they are, and make an effort to reduce the deal these other people are getting. We could also try to alter the comparison person's inputs. That would really mean trying to talk to the other people and suggest to them that they might put less in, and that would mean then that they get the reward for putting less in, or perhaps to change the way they're working, or to increase the effort that they're putting in. We might change the comparisons, and very often this is something that's helpful to deal with the problem. Sometimes we look at other people, in other words, broaden our search for people to compare with ourselves, and maybe we'll then find people who are getting either a similar deal to ourselves, or one which might even be worse. And finally, of course, we can rationalise the inequity. In other words, we can try to explain it away and re-examine why we think it's unfair in the first place, and try to maybe re-examine some of the assumptions we made about how much work we're putting in, or how much other people are putting in, and so forth. And if that doesn't work, people are motivated to perhaps leave the situation because of the inequity they perceive. So Adams' equity theory then suggests to us that there is this equity balance in people's minds, and that they are conscious of it throughout, and that if they perceive inequity in how they are being dealt with, they'll try to reduce that inequity, and they'll consider a range of ways of doing this. There are some criticisms of the equity theory. It has been researched quite often, and it has actually stood up quite well. It seems to be more applicable to bonus or piece rate payments, and that's true. And there may not be the comparability between jobs if they're knowledge work type jobs that there is perhaps in manufacturing, where it's very clear what people make and the rewards they get for actually producing the units they produce. Some individuals are more sensitive about equity than others. That's true. People differ in the extent to which they are disturbed by a perceived inequity. And then, of course, perception is critical. In other words, how people see other people and see the effort they put in is critical, and we all vary in the way we do this. Goal setting theory is another one of the process theories that is important in the organisation. The idea of goal setting theory is that goal-directed effort is put in. That results in performance, and performance results in either intrinsic or extrinsic rewards which yield satisfaction. In order to achieve the goal-directed effort, goal difficulty and goal specificity are important. Goal difficulty is back again, I suppose, to the challenge presented by the goal, the extent to which people have to strive in order to reach the goal, and that is a motivator in itself, and also goal specificity, the extent to which it is clear what people are expected to achieve in the organisation. If this is unclear, then the effort is unlikely to be directed properly. Also, there's the question of acceptance of the goal. So goal acceptance, meaning the extent to which individuals actually accept the goals that have been set for them. That impacts on the extent of motivation provided by this, and also, of course, the goal commitment, the extent to which, even if they accept the goal, the extent to which they're actually committed to achieving it, that they feel it's worthwhile doing and they put their heart and mind to it. They don't result necessarily in satisfactory performance, because there is also the issue of organisational support. The extent to which the organisation provides support for people to actually achieve, and then the individual's abilities, traits, etc. They impact on the level of performance as well. So within Locke's goal-setting theory, we see here that it is certainly important to provide people with challenging goals, to make these goals clear, to support them in their effort to achieve, and then to provide the reward at the end of the achievement. Again, some criticisms of goal-setting theory. It has been widely tested in different settings. Goal difficulty and specificity have been well linked with performance, but the other elements not necessarily as well linked. There's a danger that goal focus may be too narrow, and this would ignore the softer skills. Effectively, this means that if the goals are very quantifiable and the focus is on simply how much a person produces, the way they go about producing results can sometimes not get the weight that it deserves, and as a consequence people may achieve targets but do damage to people around them, or fail to work cooperatively with customers or with their colleagues in order to achieve these results, and that could have long-term effects for the organisation. Finally, under the process theories, we look at theory X and theory Y. Now, these are based on the assumption that motivational approaches are usually based on managers' views of the world. Douglas McGregor proposed that there are two such views. Theory X, that suggests that workers have little ambition, they dislike work, they avoid responsibility, and they need to be closely monitored. Managers who subscribe to Theory X are more likely to favour tight job specifications, pay for performance, and close supervision. In other words, their belief that people left on their own won't necessarily work very hard, that leads them to create a work environment which is very much controlled, monitored, and that pay is given only for the performance done. On the other hand, McGregor claims that there are managers who believe in what he calls Theory Y, and that is that workers actually enjoy work, they'll seek out and accept responsibility, and they are capable of exercising self-direction. So the managers who hold that view of the world are likely to favour recognition for work done, development opportunity for their workers, and flexibility at work practices. So basically, McGregor's theory talks about two philosophies that managers can hold about how people work and what motivates them. And depending on the philosophy which a manager holds, then he or she is likely to create different types of work environments in order to motivate workers. Before we finish, let us just summarise the main points that were covered in this seminar. Research into motivation explores why we choose to behave in one way rather than another. It does so from two perspectives: our needs and our mental processes, and how these interact with each other. Many theories have emerged with some overlap and some disagreement. These theories, although not conclusive, help managers to explain, predict, and influence behaviour. Finally, one size certainly does not fit all. Differences in our personality, values, culture, life stage, etc. all influence what motivates us. This concludes the presentation, but before we finish, just take a few minutes to reflect on it and note down the main ideas you would take from it. Then you can compare them with mine. Here are some of mine. Given the importance of people to the success of organizations, it's not surprising that motivation is being researched so much. One size does not fit all. The increasing diversity in the workforce requires greater knowledge of individual circumstances of each worker. Many theories try to explain what motivates us and how. They all have their critics, but they each add to our understanding of this complex topic. It seems to be the expectation of a reward that drives us rather than the actual receipt of the reward itself. So it's our belief that we will get it that causes us to behave in a certain way rather than the actual receipt of it. Finally, our sense of justice or injustice is an important factor in all of this. The material for this seminar has been taken from the following reference textbooks. You may find them useful to refer to for greater depth.